Long before Atlantis was imagined as a glittering empire swallowed by the sea, the ancient Mediterranean world was already rich with stories that tried to explain the origins of civilization, the rise of power, and the sudden collapse of societies. These stories were not written as fantasies in the modern sense, but as serious attempts to understand humanity's past through memory, myth, and moral reflection. Atlantis emerges from this tradition, standing at the boundary where history, philosophy, and legend meet. The earliest and only detailed ancient account of Atlantis comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, Plato presents the story not as a poetic invention, but as a tale passed down through generations, originating, he claims, from ancient Egyptian records. Whether this claim reflects genuine tradition or serves a philosophical purpose remains a subject of debate. Yet it frames Atlantis as something older than classical Greece, belonging to a deep and distant antiquity. Plato situates the origin of the Atlantis story with Solon, the Athenian lawgiver of the 6th century BCE, one of the 7 sages of Greece. According to the dialogue, Solon traveled to Egypt, where priests at the city of Sais told him of a forgotten war between prehistoric Athens and a powerful island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles, known today as the Strait of Gibraltar. The Egyptian priests chastised the Greeks for their short memory, explaining that repeated natural disasters had erased their ancient history, leaving only fragments behind. In the worldview of the ancient Mediterranean, Egypt was considered a repository of timeless knowledge. Its monumental architecture, long dynastic history, and stable river-based civilization inspired awe among Greek visitors. By anchoring the story of Atlantis in Egyptian tradition, Plato gave it an air of antiquity and authority that his audience would have taken seriously, even if they questioned its literal truth. The priests described Atlantis as existing 9,000 years before Solon's time, placing its origin around 9600 BCE. This date, extraordinary by Greek standards, pushed Atlantis back into a period we now associate with the end of the last ice age. Modern archaeology shows that this era was marked by dramatic environmental changes, including rising sea levels, melting ice sheets, and shifting coastlines. While there is no evidence of a global empire at this time, the memory of lost lands and drowned shorelines may have lingered in human storytelling for millennia. According to the accounts, Atlantis was a vast island situated in the Atlantic Ocean, larger than Libya and Asia combined, as those regions were understood in antiquity. From this island, its inhabitants controlled other islands and parts of the mainland, extending their influence across the western Mediterranean. This geographical description has inspired centuries of speculation, yet it reflects a symbolic geography as much as a physical one, placing Atlantis at the edge of the known world beyond familiar maps. Plato traces the earliest origins of Atlantis not to human ambition but to the gods. In the mythic past, the gods divided the earth among themselves by lot. Poseidon, god of the sea, received Atlantis as his domain. There he fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, who lived on a hill near the center of the island. To protect her, Poseidon reshaped the land, carving concentric rings of sea and land around the hill, creating a natural fortress unlike anything else in the world. This divine intervention establishes Atlantis as a civilization born from both mortal and divine elements. Cleito bore Poseidon 10 sons, 5 pairs of twins, who became the first kings of Atlantis. The eldest, Atlas, gave his name to the island and the surrounding ocean. From the beginning, Atlantis was organized as a kingdom of kings, bound by laws said to have been inscribed by Poseidon himself on a pillar of orichalcum, a legendary metal described as second only to gold in value. The early Atlanteans, according to Plato, lived in harmony with the natural world and with the divine laws set by their godly ancestor. Their society was orderly and prosperous, benefiting from fertile land, abundant resources, and a mild climate. This initial age of Atlantis resembles other ancient myths of a golden age, a time when humanity lived closer to the gods before corruption and excess took hold. In framing Atlantis this way, Plato aligns it with a broader tradition found across cultures, where the earliest phase of civilization is portrayed as morally superior to later ages. This pattern appears in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek traditions alike, suggesting that Atlantis functions not only as a historical claim, but as a moral narrative about decline. From an archaeological perspective, the world around 9600 BCE was populated by hunter-gatherer societies and early sedentary communities, such as those later uncovered at sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey. These discoveries have shown that complex ritual structures existed earlier than once believed, though they bear no direct connection to Atlantis. Still, they remind us that the deep past was more sophisticated than earlier generations assumed. The story of Atlantis begins then not with its destruction, but with its creation as an idealized civilization. It is a tale rooted in ancient conceptions of time, memory, and moral order. Whether Plato drew on older legends, misunderstood Egyptian chronology, or constructed the story as a philosophical allegory, Atlantis enters history as a symbol of humanity's potential for greatness and its vulnerability to loss. As the narrative moves forward, Atlantis will grow from a divine foundation into a powerful human empire. Its early harmony will be tested by wealth, expansion, and ambition. For now, at the dawn of its story, Atlantis stands untouched, encircled by the sea, governed by gods and kings, and preserved in the fragile medium of memory, waiting for the forces that will shape its destiny. In the intellectual climate of classical Athens, where Plato wrote, stories like Atlantis served multiple purposes. They connected the present to an imagined past, offering a mirror through which contemporary society could be examined. Athens itself had recently endured war, plague, and political upheaval. The memory of greatness followed by ruin was not abstract but lived experience. Against this backdrop, Atlantis becomes a distant reflection of familiar anxieties about power and moral decay. Plato's use of dialogue is significant. The Atlantis story is not presented as a standalone chronicle, but as part of a philosophical conversation about the nature of the ideal state, the origins of the cosmos, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. In Timaeus, the focus lies on cosmology and order, while Critias, left unfinished, turns toward the detailed description of Atlantis and ancient Athens. This framing suggests that Plato was less concerned with historical precision than with using the past as a teaching instrument. Yet it would be a mistake to dismiss the story as pure invention without context. Ancient authors frequently blended history and myth, seeing no sharp boundary between them. Herodotus, often called the father of history, reported marvels and hearsay alongside eyewitness accounts. For Plato's audience, the question was not whether every detail was factual, but whether the story conveyed a deeper truth about human nature and the consequences of moral failure. The Egyptians' claim that Greece had forgotten its own ancient past reflects a real difference in historical continuity. Egyptian civilization extended back thousands of years by Plato's time, while Greece had experienced a collapse at the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, followed by centuries of cultural loss. The notion that earlier records were destroyed by floods and fires echoes genuine natural disasters known in the Eastern Mediterranean, including earthquakes and regional inundations. In Greek thought, water played a dual role as both giver and destroyer of life. Flood myths were common, most famously the story of Deucalion, who survived a great deluge sent by Zeus to punish humanity. Atlantis fits within this symbolic framework, associating the sea with both wealth and annihilation. An island empire dependent on maritime power would naturally meet its end through the same element that sustained it. The description of Atlantis' early organization reflects an idealized balance between hierarchy and law. The kings ruled jointly, bound by shared ancestry and sacred obligations. They were forbidden to fight one another and required to meet regularly to deliberate and judge. Such details mirror Greek debates about governance, contrasting lawful order with tyranny and chaos. Even the concentric design of Atlantis' capital carries philosophical meaning. Circles represented perfection and harmony in Greek mathematics and cosmology. By placing the city within rings of water and land, Plato evokes an image of cosmic order imposed upon the earth, an architectural expression of balance between nature and intellect. At this earliest stage of the story, Atlantis is not yet an aggressor or a cautionary tale. It is a model of what a civilization might achieve when guided by divine principles and restrained desire. Its people possess advanced skills in agriculture, engineering, and navigation, but these gifts are portrayed as blessings rather than tools of domination. Thus, the beginning of Atlantis is marked by promise. It belongs to an age when the world was younger, memory deeper, and the bond between gods and humans more direct. With the divine foundations of Atlantis established, the island entered a long formative age during which mythic origins slowly gave way to human institutions. The sons of Poseidon inherited not only territory but responsibility, ruling as custodians rather than conquerors. Each king governed a portion of the island, yet all acknowledged the supremacy of Atlas, whose lineage embodied unity. This early confederation shaped Atlantis into a single civilization rather than competing realms, allowing stability to take root across generations without violent succession or civil strife. Tradition, ritual, and law reinforced obedience, while memory preserved harmony across generations and time itself. As centuries passed, Atlantean society matured, transforming divine instruction into codified governance. The laws attributed to Poseidon were no longer merely sacred symbols, but practical frameworks shaping daily life. Councils of elders advised the kings, resolving disputes and regulating trade, land use, and inheritance. Power remained hereditary, yet it was restrained by oaths sworn over sacred relics. These ceremonies emphasized accountability, reminding rulers that authority existed to serve balance rather than personal ambition. Such systems limited corruption during Atlantis's early expansion across surrounding seas and islands, maintaining unity, prosperity, and public trust for generations without sustained internal dissent or upheaval. The land itself shaped Atlantean character. The island possessed fertile plains, forested mountains, and mineral-rich hills, producing abundance with little struggle. Sophisticated irrigation channeled seasonal rains, while carefully planned agriculture ensured consistent harvests. This security freed much of the population from subsistence labor, allowing specialization in crafts, navigation, metallurgy, and architecture. Wealth accumulated steadily, not yet as excess, but as shared prosperity, reinforcing social cohesion. Villages expanded into cities connected by roads, canals, and ceremonial routes. Urban planning reflected order, symmetry, and reverence for cosmic principles inherited from divine teachings and ancestral memory, preserved carefully through ritual practice and tradition. At the heart of Atlantis rose the capital, a ceremonial and administrative center unlike any known elsewhere. Its concentric rings of water and land enclosed palaces, temples, and harbors, linked by bridges aligned with cardinal directions. Ships passed through carved channels from the outer sea into the inner basins, demonstrating engineering mastery. The central temple of Poseidon dominated the skyline, its walls plated with metals that reflected sunlight and sea spray alike. Statues, gardens, and public spaces conveyed reverence, authority, and communal identity. Every structure reinforced hierarchy while celebrating shared Atlantean destiny through art, ritual, and disciplined design principles enduring. Religion permeated all aspects of Atlantean life, blending divine ancestry with civic duty. Poseidon remained supreme, but other gods were honored in temples and seasonal festivals. Sacrifices, processions, and athletic contests reinforced collective identity and loyalty to the ruling line. Myth and law intertwined, teaching that prosperity flowed from moderation and respect for limits. Priests served as record keepers, astronomers, and moral guardians, preserving tradition across centuries. Calendars tracked celestial cycles, aligning ritual life with cosmic order. This worldview anchored society against chaos, reinforcing humility before divine forces believed essential for survival and harmony within land and sea alike forever. During this long age of stability, Atlantis began to look outward beyond its shores. Mariners explored neighboring islands, mapping currents, winds, and coastlines with increasing precision. Trade networks emerged, exchanging metals, timber, dyes, and agricultural surplus. Contact with distant peoples brought new ideas and technologies, enriching Atlantean knowledge. Expansion remained measured, framed as stewardship rather than conquest, guided by laws emphasizing balance and mutual benefit. Colonies functioned as outposts of culture, not instruments of domination. Local customs were respected, while alliances replaced subjugation. This approach strengthened reputation and extended influence peacefully across oceans and generations alike, without immediate resistance emerging. Yet prosperity subtly altered Atlantean values. Abundance dulled caution, and wealth became a marker of prestige rather than collective security. Metals once reserved for sacred purposes adorned private estates. The ruling class grew increasingly distant from ordinary citizens, insulated by luxury. Though laws remained unchanged, their spirit weakened as ritual replaced genuine restraint. This shift marked the earliest, nearly imperceptible departure from the ideals of Atlantis's founding age. Moral decay advanced quietly, unnoticed amid celebration and expansion. Warnings from priests and elders were increasingly dismissed as pessimism incompatible with confidence and power, defining Atlantis' growing self-image as destined ruler forever. This internal transformation unfolded over generations, not in sudden collapse. Children of privilege inherited entitlement rather than obligation. Education emphasized mastery and command, less humility and service. Competitive displays of wealth became common, reshaping social norms. The memory of divine origin persisted, yet increasingly as justification for dominance rather than guidance toward moderation. Atlantis remained orderly, but its order now served ambition more than harmony. Philosophical balance yielded to confidence in technological superiority. Engineering feats multiplied, impressing allies and intimidating rivals. Power projected outward reshaped Atlantis' relationship with the world, from guardian to arbiter of fate across distant seas everywhere. By the end of this era, Atlantis stood unmatched in influence and wealth. Its fleets dominated trade routes, its cities gleamed with resources drawn from land and sea. Foreign rulers sought alliance or tribute, recognizing Atlantean supremacy. Internally, dissent remained rare, suppressed not by force but by prosperity. Yet beneath success lay fragility, for unity founded on excess cannot endure indefinitely. Ancient balance had shifted, though catastrophe still seemed unthinkable. The sea that once protected Atlantis now carried its ambitions outward. Power invited scrutiny from gods, nature, and history alike, setting unseen forces quietly in motion beyond mortal perception, slowly. Thus concluded Atlantis' ascent, a civilization transitioning from ideal harmony to confident dominance. Its foundations remained impressive, its achievements undeniable, yet the moral equilibrium that once sustained it had eroded. The story now moves toward confrontation between human ambition and cosmic order, a tension deeply familiar to ancient storytellers. The stage was set, not for immediate ruin, but for choices that would determine fate. Atlantis still shone brilliantly, unaware of gathering consequences. History records such moments as thresholds rather than endings. Beyond them lies transformation, often sudden and unforgiving. Atlantis approached that boundary unknowingly confident in eternal supremacy and stability. In distant lands, awareness of Atlantis provoked mixed reactions. Some societies admired its order and sought emulation, while others feared its reach. Legends traveled faster than ships, exaggerating Atlantean power into near divinity. Such perceptions reinforced Atlantis' self-image as chosen and invulnerable. Diplomacy increasingly gave way to demands justified as civilizing influence. This subtle shift signaled a change in how Atlantis viewed the world beyond itself. Moral authority blurred with political convenience. Foreign resistance, though limited, began quietly forming. Such tensions foreshadowed conflict masked by apparent peace beneath ceremonial exchanges and treaties crafted to preserve advantage for Atlantis alone always. Within Atlantis, intellectual life flourished alongside material excess. Scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, convinced reason could master nature entirely. Knowledge once pursued for harmony now served control. Predictions of storms, earthquakes, and tides improved, yet humility before uncertainty diminished. Confidence replaced caution. This belief in mastery over natural forces would later prove tragically misplaced, but at the time it reinforced a sense of destiny. Human achievement appeared limitless under Atlantean intellect. Warnings encoded in ancient myths were increasingly ignored. Progress became doctrine, eclipsing ancestral caution and reverence for uncontrollable forces governing earth and sea since creation itself ancient. Generations after Atlas, the divine blood of kings diluted, though authority remained absolute. Rulers increasingly resembled powerful men rather than sacred intermediaries. Laws persisted, but enforcement favored elites. Inequality widened subtly, then visibly. Public works continued, yet their purpose shifted toward spectacle. Atlantis impressed itself as much as the world, mistaking admiration for virtue and obedience for unity. Social contracts frayed without open revolt or awareness. Comfort masked decay, delaying recognition of imbalance. Such conditions historically precede sudden systemic failure, though contemporaries rarely perceive warning signs until collapse forces understanding upon societies unprepared to adapt swiftly under pressure from reality. As Atlantis approached the height of its power, omens entered collective memory. Unusual seismic tremors, unpredictable tides, and violent storms unsettled coastal regions. Priests debated meanings, while officials reassured populations. Advanced knowledge mitigated damage, reinforcing confidence. Few interpreted these signs as warnings of moral imbalance. Instead, they were framed as challenges to overcome, further proof of Atlantean superiority over nature. Public ceremonies celebrated resilience, masking underlying anxiety. Collective memory stored unease without articulation. History shows such denial often precedes catastrophe when warning becomes reality without transition, leaving no time for correction once balance finally breaks across land and sea simultaneously. Thus, at the threshold of its greatest dominance, Atlantis unknowingly prepared its own undoing. The seeds were not external enemies, but internal transformations long ignored. Power, confidence, and excess reshaped values inherited from divine origins. The civilization remained magnificent yet fragile. What followed would test the ancient belief that no society, however advanced, stands beyond the reach of cosmic balance and consequence. The next era would bring confrontation, judgment, and irreversible loss. Atlantis' fate now intertwined with forces long underestimated. History would remember lessons written in water and stone after the illusion of permanence shattered before all witnesses forever remembered. As Atlantis entered the next phase of its history, the balance between prosperity and restraint finally tipped. What had once been outward exploration driven by curiosity and trade evolved into deliberate expansion motivated by dominance. The ruling kings, confident in their fleets and technologies, began to see the surrounding world not as a network of equals, but as a field of influence awaiting order. This shift was gradual, unfolding across generations, yet its consequences reshaped Atlantis' relationship with humanity and with the ideals upon which it had been founded. Atlantean fleets multiplied and standardized, becoming instruments of both commerce and intimidation. Shipyards worked continuously, producing vessels capable of crossing vast distances and carrying large contingents of soldiers. Navigation had become a science informed by astronomy and long-kept maritime records. With these advantages, Atlantis extended control over neighboring islands and coastal territories. Some regions accepted Atlantean authority willingly, drawn by promises of protection and wealth. Others resisted, only to be overwhelmed by superior organization rather than brute violence. This era marked the first time Atlantis imposed its will beyond its cultural sphere. Governors were installed in distant lands tasked with extracting tribute and maintaining order. While local customs were initially respected, economic demands increased steadily. Resources flowed toward the Atlantean capital, further enriching elites and deepening inequality. The ruling class justified these measures as necessary to sustain peace and stability. In truth, empire had replaced stewardship and ambition eclipsed moderation. Plato's account emphasizes that this transformation was not merely political but moral. The divine element within Atlanteans, he writes, became diluted over time, overwhelmed by mortal desires. Wealth bred arrogance, and power fostered contempt for limits. The laws of Poseidon, once revered, were observed in form but not in spirit. Kings still swore oaths, but these rituals no longer restrained their actions. The collective memory of humility faded, replaced by confidence in human supremacy. As Atlantis expanded eastward, its influence reached the Mediterranean basin. According to the Egyptian priests, the Atlanteans eventually controlled parts of North Africa and southern Europe. These claims reflect a symbolic geography rather than verifiable conquest, yet they convey a clear idea. Atlantis had become the dominant power of its imagined world. Its presence disrupted existing societies, altering trade routes and political balances. Fear and resentment grew alongside dependence. It was during this phase that Atlantis encountered its greatest ideological rival, ancient Athens. Plato portrays this Athens not as the city of his own time, but as a prehistoric ideal state governed by virtue, discipline, and equality. This Athens represented everything Atlantis had ceased to be. Where Atlantis embodied wealth and expansion, Athens embodied restraint and civic duty. The contrast served Plato's philosophical aims, but it also framed the central conflict of the Atlantis narrative. The war between Atlantis and Athens is described as a struggle between excess and moderation. Atlantean forces advanced toward the eastern Mediterranean, subjugating many peoples along the way. Athens, though smaller and less wealthy, stood firm, defending not only itself but the freedom of others. In this telling, Athens emerged as the unlikely victor, repelling the Atlantean advance through courage and unity rather than superior force. From a historical perspective, no evidence exists for such a war in the deep prehistoric past. Archaeology does not support the existence of a global empire or a highly advanced Athens in 9600 BCE. Yet the narrative reflects familiar patterns from later Greek history, particularly the Persian Wars, in which Athens confronted a vast empire and defined itself through resistance. Plato's audience would have recognized these parallels, understanding Atlantis as a mirror through which to view their own world. Within the story, the defeat of Atlantis marked a turning point. The island empire, once unstoppable, encountered limits imposed by moral opposition rather than natural force. This failure exposed internal weaknesses long concealed by success. Confidence faltered, and unity strained under the weight of ambition unmet. The kings faced unrest among subject territories and dissatisfaction at home. The illusion of invincibility shattered, leaving Atlantis vulnerable for the first time in centuries. Nature, too, seemed to respond to this imbalance. Plato describes a period of increasing instability marked by earthquakes and floods affecting both Atlantis and Athens. In ancient thought, such events were interpreted as expressions of divine displeasure or cosmic correction. The connection between moral decay and natural disaster was deeply ingrained in Greek philosophy. Excess invited retribution, not as punishment but as restoration of order. For Atlantis, these signs were ominous. Infrastructure suffered damage, and coastal settlements faced erosion and flooding. Engineers worked tirelessly to reinforce harbors and canals, applying technical solutions to problems that had once been met with reverence. Their efforts delayed disaster but reinforced the belief that human ingenuity could overcome any threat. This faith in mastery further alienated Atlanteans from the humility that once guided them. Political tensions intensified. Some leaders argued for reform and restraint, urging a return to ancient laws. Others demanded renewed conquest to reassert dominance and secure resources. The latter prevailed, accelerating decline. Expansion continued despite warnings, draining manpower and fostering resistance. The empire grew increasingly brittle, sustained by force rather than loyalty. In Plato's telling, the final judgment came swiftly. After a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea. The island sank beneath the waves, leaving behind impassable mud shoals where ships could no longer sail. This sudden annihilation erased the empire entirely, preserving it only in memory and legend. Athens, too, suffered destruction, though less completely, reinforcing the idea that no society escapes nature's power. Modern scholars interpret this ending symbolically rather than literally. The abrupt collapse mirrors the fate of many historical civilizations, undone by environmental stress, overextension, and internal decay. The image of a single catastrophic event compresses complex processes into a dramatic conclusion suited to moral storytelling. Atlantis becomes a cautionary tale, illustrating the dangers of hubris and the fragility of human achievement. Yet the story does not end with destruction alone. The disappearance of Atlantis also represents the loss of knowledge and memory. Plato emphasizes that mud and shallow waters prevented further exploration, severing connection between past and present. This motif echoes Greek awareness of forgotten ages and vanished cultures, reinforcing the theme of historical amnesia. Atlantis survives only through transmission of story, vulnerable to distortion and doubt. As the Atlantean Empire vanished beneath the sea, its legacy transformed. What had been history became myth, and what had been warning became speculation. Later generations would debate whether Atlantis had ever existed at all, searching for physical traces and symbolic meanings alike. The empire's fall marked the transition from lived memory to legend, from moral lesson to enduring mystery. Thus, Atlantis passed from the realm of power into the realm of story. Its rise and fall encapsulated a complete cycle, from divine origin to human excess, from harmony to collapse. The next stage of its history would unfold not in stone or sea, but in interpretation, as philosophers, historians, and dreamers sought to understand what Atlantis truly represented, and why its shadow lingered long after its imagined shores disappeared beneath the waves. When Atlantis vanished beneath the sea, its destruction did not end its history. Instead, it transformed that history. The suddenness of the cataclysm marked a rupture between experience and remembrance, between lived reality and inherited story. What followed was not silence, but fragmentation. Knowledge of Atlantis survived only in distorted echoes, preserved unevenly across cultures that no longer fully understood what had been lost. In Plato's account, the sinking of Atlantis occurred within a single day and night of misfortune. Earthquakes shattered the land, floods surged across the island, and the sea closed over the ruins. This compression of time reflects ancient narrative tradition rather than geological realism. Civilizations rarely vanish instantaneously, yet memory often recalls collapse as sudden because trauma erases gradual processes. For the Atlanteans who survived elsewhere, if any did, the loss would have been total. Homeland, institutions, sacred centers, and ancestral identity gone at once. The sea that swallowed Atlantis also erased physical access to its remains. Plato describes the aftermath as a shallow, muddy region, impassable to ships. In symbolic terms, this detail serves a clear purpose. Atlantis could no longer be verified, explored, or reclaimed. It was removed from geography and placed into memory alone. This ensured that future generations could debate its meaning without ever confirming its reality. The story became untethered from material evidence, vulnerable to reinterpretation and doubt. In the ancient Mediterranean world, such losses were not unimaginable. Coastal flooding, tsunamis, and earthquakes were familiar dangers. Archaeology has confirmed that entire Bronze Age cities were destroyed by seismic events and inundation, most famously along the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Oral traditions preserved memories of these disasters long after ruins disappeared beneath sediment or sea. Atlantis fits within this broader human experience of environmental catastrophe remembered through mythic language. After the fall, Plato tells us, Athens too suffered devastation. Floods and earthquakes erased records, leaving later Greeks ignorant of their own prehistoric achievements. This mutual destruction reinforces the moral symmetry of the narrative. Although Athens was virtuous, it was not exempt from nature's power. The difference lay in legacy. Athens endured, while Atlantis did not. One society retained continuity, the other dissolved entirely. Survival, not supremacy, became the measure of success. In the centuries following the supposed destruction, the memory of Atlantis faded unevenly. If the story had once circulated more widely, it did so in altered forms. Oral traditions compress, embellish, and adapt. Names change, locations shift, causes blur. Over time, Atlantis ceased to be remembered as a specific island and became instead a symbol of a lost age. Its geographic identity dissolved, leaving behind themes rather than maps. Egypt, in Plato's account, served as the final custodian of the Atlantean memory. This detail reflects Greek respect for Egyptian antiquity and record-keeping, but it also highlights a deeper idea, that civilizations with continuity preserve memory, while those prone to collapse forget. Egypt's relative stability contrasted sharply with Greece's cycles of rise and fall. By placing Atlantis in Egyptian records, Plato suggested that truth survives only where institutions endure. From a historical standpoint, Egyptian priests did preserve king lists, myths, and cosmological narratives stretching back thousands of years. Yet no known Egyptian text mentions Atlantis directly. This absence suggests that Plato either reinterpreted Egyptian ideas, misunderstood symbolic chronologies, or employed Egypt as a rhetorical authority. Regardless, the framing shaped how later generations understood the story's age and seriousness. As Greek civilization evolved, Atlantis remained largely dormant in literature. Classical historians such as Herodotus did not mention it. Aristotle, Plato's student, reportedly dismissed the story as fiction, suggesting that the same man who invented Atlantis also destroyed it. This skepticism indicates that even in antiquity the tale was contested. Atlantis existed in a liminal space neither fully accepted nor fully rejected. Despite this, the themes embodied by Atlantis endured. Greek tragedy repeatedly explored the consequences of hubris, the danger of excess, and the inevitability of divine or natural correction. These ideas did not require Atlantis to be real. Its function as moral exemplum was sufficient. In this sense, Atlantis became less a place than a warning encoded in narrative form. Beyond Greece, other cultures preserved flood myths and stories of sunken lands. Mesopotamian traditions, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, spoke of a great deluge destroying early humanity. Indian texts describe cycles of creation and destruction governed by cosmic law. In the Americas, indigenous traditions told of ancestral homelands lost to water. These parallels do not prove a shared memory of Atlantis, but they reveal a universal human response to environmental change and loss. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Atlantis occasionally resurfaced as a subject of curiosity rather than doctrine. Philosophers and geographers debated the extent of the known world, speculating about lands beyond the Atlantic. Some identified Atlantis with distant islands or interpreted it allegorically as a vanished continent representing an earlier stage of humanity. The lack of evidence kept such discussions speculative and restrained. Roman writers were generally pragmatic, favoring administrative geography over mythic landscapes. As a result, Atlantis never became central to Roman thought. It lingered instead at the margins, preserved mainly through Plato's texts. Had those dialogues been lost, Atlantis might have vanished entirely from Western memory. Its survival depended not on belief, but on manuscript transmission. With the decline of the Western Roman Empire, classical learning fragmented. Plato's works survived unevenly, preserved in the Byzantine world and later reintroduced to Western Europe through Islamic scholarship and medieval translation movements. During this long interval, Atlantis remained largely unknown in the Latin West. Medieval Europe focused on biblical history, viewing time through a theological lens that left little room for pagan lost civilizations. Yet even in this period, the idea of drowned lands persisted indirectly. Legends of sunken cities, cursed kingdoms, and divine punishments circulated in folklore. These stories echoed the Atlantean pattern without explicit reference. They reflected enduring human anxiety about impermanence and moral failure. The sea remained a symbol of both mystery and judgment. It was only with the revival of classical learning during the Renaissance that Atlantis re-emerged clearly into European consciousness. Plato's dialogues were studied anew, not merely as philosophy, but as potential historical sources. Scholars began to ask whether Atlantis could have been real, and if so, where it might have been located. This shift marked a turning point. Atlantis moved from moral allegory toward historical hypothesis. The Renaissance mindset valued ancient authority while embracing exploration. As European sailors crossed the Atlantic and encountered new continents, Plato's description of a land beyond the Pillars of Heracles acquired fresh relevance. The world was suddenly larger than medieval maps had allowed. Lost lands no longer seemed impossible. Atlantis entered a new phase of its existence, not as a warning, but as a question. This transformation did not yet abandon caution. Early scholars approached Atlantis with restraint, aware of the symbolic nature of ancient texts. Still, the seed of speculation had been planted. The destruction of Atlantis no longer marked an ending, but a beginning of inquiry. Its absence invited imagination, its silence provoked search. Thus, from the moment it sank, Atlantis began a second life. No longer a civilization, it became an idea, shaped by each era's fears, hopes, and intellectual tools. The next chapters of its history would unfold not beneath the sea, but within human thought, as explorers, philosophers, and later scientists attempted to recover what had been lost, or to redefine what Atlantis had always truly been. When classical texts re-entered Western Europe during the Renaissance, Atlantis resurfaced from centuries of near obscurity. Plato's dialogues, translated and circulated among scholars, philosophers, and courtiers, ignited renewed fascination with the ancient world. The Renaissance mind revered antiquity as a source of wisdom rather than superstition. Atlantis was no longer dismissed outright as myth, nor accepted blindly as history. Instead, it became an intellectual challenge, a puzzle inherited from the ancients, and now open to reinterpretation through reason, geography, and emerging scientific curiosity. This period marked a profound shift in how Atlantis was understood. Medieval thinkers had framed history almost exclusively through biblical chronology, leaving little space for pagan lost civilizations. Renaissance scholars, however, embraced multiple timelines and sources. Plato's authority carried immense weight, and his insistence that Atlantis was drawn from Egyptian records intrigued readers accustomed to rediscovering forgotten knowledge. The story's great antiquity no longer seemed impossible in an age uncovering Roman ruins and ancient manuscripts buried by time and neglect. Simultaneously, the age of exploration reshaped perceptions of the world. European voyages across the Atlantic revealed continents unknown to classical geographers. Maps expanded rapidly, and with them, imagination. Plato's description of a vast land beyond the Pillars of Heracles suddenly appeared plausible. Some speculated that the newly encountered Americas were remnants of Atlantis, or evidence that ancient knowledge of the Atlantic world had been lost. The coincidence of location, scale, and mystery proved irresistible to many Renaissance thinkers. Early theorists approached Atlantis cautiously. Humanists such as Marsilio Ficino treated Plato's account primarily as philosophical allegory, emphasizing its moral lessons over literal geography. Others, however, leaned toward historicity. They argued that ancient authors often embedded real events within mythic language. Floods, earthquakes, and submerged lands were known phenomena. If Troy, once considered legendary, had been rediscovered through archaeology centuries later, why not Atlantis? This reasoning did not prove Atlantis existed, but it made disbelief seem premature. As printing spread, so did speculation. Atlantis appeared in essays, maps, and cosmographical works. Some cartographers tentatively placed it in the Atlantic, labeling regions with suggestive names rather than firm claims. Others linked Atlantis to the Canary Islands, the Azores, or the Caribbean. These identifications relied less on evidence than on imaginative alignment between Plato's text and contemporary geography. Atlantis became a canvas onto which Renaissance Europe projected its hopes of ancient wisdom reclaimed. Crucially, this era transformed Atlantis from a moral narrative into a geographical hypothesis. The shift reflected broader changes in European thought. Observation and comparison began to rival inherited authority. Scholars measured distances, compared descriptions, and debated translations. Discrepancies within Plato's text were analyzed critically rather than ignored. The question was no longer simply whether Atlantis taught a lesson, but whether it described a place that might once have existed and now lay hidden beneath ocean or time. Yet skepticism persisted alongside enthusiasm. Some scholars pointed out inconsistencies in Plato's chronology, particularly the claim of events occurring 9,000 years before Solon. Others noted the absence of corroborating evidence in Egyptian records known at the time. These objections prevented consensus and kept Atlantis suspended between possibility and doubt. The debate itself, however, ensured its survival. Atlantis became relevant not because it was believed, but because it was argued. By the late Renaissance, Atlantis had secured a permanent place in European intellectual culture. It symbolized the fragility of civilization, the limits of memory, and the allure of lost knowledge. Explorers carried its shadow across oceans. Philosophers invoked it in discussions of ideal states, and scholars treated it as a test case for interpreting ancient texts. Atlantis no longer belonged solely to Plato. It had become a shared inheritance, reshaped by discovery, curiosity, and the expanding horizon of the known world. This revival did not resolve Atlantis's mystery. Instead, it ensured that the question of its existence would endure. The Renaissance transformed Atlantis from forgotten legend into active inquiry. From this point onward, every advance in geography, geology, and archaeology would reopen the debate. Atlantis had crossed a threshold. It was no longer merely lost beneath the sea. It was lost within history itself, waiting to be claimed, explained, or finally dismissed by future generations. As Europe entered the Enlightenment, the story of Atlantis encountered a new intellectual climate defined by skepticism, empirical inquiry, and the systematic study of nature. Reason was elevated as the primary path to truth, and ancient authorities were no longer accepted without challenge. In this atmosphere, Atlantis became a battleground between emerging scientific standards and the enduring human fascination with lost worlds. The question was no longer merely where Atlantis might have been, but whether it could have existed at all. Enlightenment thinkers approached Plato with respect, but not reverence. His philosophical brilliance was widely acknowledged, yet his blending of myth and argument invited scrutiny. Scholars began to separate Plato, the moral philosopher, from Plato, the historical source. Many concluded that Atlantis functioned primarily as an allegory, designed to illustrate political and ethical principles rather than record actual events. This interpretation aligned well with Enlightenment priorities, which favored clarity, evidence, and rational explanation over symbolic tradition. Geographers and natural philosophers examined the physical plausibility of Atlantis' sudden destruction. The idea of an entire island sinking within a single day and night conflicted with the gradualist views of geological change that were beginning to emerge. Mountains, coastlines, and seas appeared to change slowly over immense spans of time, not through abrupt annihilation. While earthquakes and floods were acknowledged, the scale of Plato's catastrophe seemed exaggerated. Atlantis, critics argued, was a narrative device, not a geological record. At the same time, advances in mapping and navigation reduced the space available for speculation. The Atlantic Ocean was increasingly charted, its islands catalogued and coastlines measured. No trace of a sunken continent appeared. The absence of ruins, artifacts, or reliable eyewitness accounts weighed heavily against literal interpretations. For many Enlightenment scholars, Atlantis joined a growing list of myths that reflected human imagination more than historical reality. Yet the Enlightenment did not silence Atlantis entirely. Instead, it reframed the debate. Some thinkers propose that Plato's account preserved a distorted memory of real but smaller-scale events. Rather than a vast island empire, Atlantis might represent a coastal civilization destroyed by flooding or seismic activity. The story's grandeur could be the result of centuries of embellishment. This compromise allowed scholars to retain respect for ancient testimony while adhering to rational standards. One influential line of thought connected Atlantis to known ancient disasters. The eruption of Thera, now known as Santorini, around the 2nd millennium BCE, had devastated the Minoan civilization of the Aegean. The eruption caused massive earthquakes, tsunamis, and atmospheric effects felt across the eastern Mediterranean. Although the chronology did not match Plato's dates, some Enlightenment thinkers suggested that such an event could have inspired later legends of a drowned civilization. Atlantis, in this view, was memory reshaped by time. Others argued that Atlantis represented a moral myth akin to those found in other cultures. Flood narratives appeared across the world, often conveying lessons about human arrogance and divine retribution. Atlantis fit neatly within this pattern. Its destruction served as a warning encoded in dramatic form. Enlightenment philosophers who favored universal human psychology over historical particularity found this explanation compelling. Atlantis became evidence of shared moral imagination rather than shared experience. Despite growing skepticism, Atlantis retained cultural power. Writers and artists continued to reference it as a symbol of lost perfection and tragic downfall. Even those who rejected its literal existence acknowledged its narrative effectiveness. The myth persisted because it addressed enduring questions: why civilizations collapse, how memory fails, and whether progress inevitably leads to decline. These concerns resonated deeply in an age grappling with rapid intellectual and social change. Importantly, the Enlightenment also laid the groundwork for future reinterpretations by developing new sciences. Geology, archaeology, and anthropology began to emerge as distinct disciplines. Though still in early stages, they promised tools that might one day test ancient claims more rigorously. Atlantis shifted again, now positioned as a hypothesis awaiting scientific judgment rather than philosophical debate alone. By the end of the Enlightenment, Atlantis occupied a paradoxical position. It was widely doubted as literal history, yet increasingly discussed as a case study in how myths form and persist. The story survived not because it resisted reason, but because it adapted to it. Each critique refined its meaning, stripping away certainty while deepening fascination. Atlantis endured as a question rather than an answer. As Europe moved toward the 19th century, intellectual confidence and reason remained strong, but cracks began to appear. Romanticism would soon challenge Enlightenment restraint, re-embracing mystery, emotion, and the sublime. In that shift, Atlantis would find renewed life, transformed once more by the changing needs and imaginations of those who sought it. The transition from Enlightenment rationalism to Romanticism marked another decisive transformation in the history of Atlantis. Where the Enlightenment sought clarity, restraint, and proof, Romanticism embraced mystery, emotion, and the power of imagination. It did not reject reason entirely, but it challenged the idea that reason alone could explain the human past. In this intellectual climate, Atlantis was no longer constrained by strict demands for evidence. It re-emerged as a symbol of forgotten wisdom, lost harmony, and the tragic beauty of civilizations erased by forces beyond human control. Romantic thinkers viewed history not merely as a sequence of events, but as a living narrative shaped by memory, myth, and spirit. They believed that ancient peoples possessed forms of knowledge modern society had lost, particularly a deeper connection to nature and the sublime. Atlantis fit perfectly within this worldview. It became an emblem of an ancient golden age, destroyed not only by catastrophe, but by humanity's estrangement from natural and moral balance. Its disappearance symbolized a rupture between the modern world and a more meaningful past. Poets, philosophers, and artists invoked Atlantis to express longing for origins that could never be recovered. In literature, it appeared as a vanished homeland whose ruins haunted the imagination. Painters depicted submerged temples and shattered columns beneath dark, restless seas. These images were not meant to document history, but to evoke loss and awe. Atlantis, in romantic expression, was less a place than a feeling, the ache of something irretrievably gone. This period also witnessed renewed speculation about ancient wisdom traditions. Some romantics believed that early civilizations shared a primordial knowledge later fragmented into religion, science, and myth. Atlantis was imagined as the center of this wisdom, a place where philosophy, art, and natural understanding existed in unity. Its destruction represented not just physical loss, but the scattering of truth across cultures and ages. This idea drew loosely from Plato's account while extending it far beyond his intentions. At the same time, Romantic nationalism reshaped interpretations of Atlantis. Emerging nation-states sought ancient origins to legitimize cultural identity. Some thinkers attempted to link Atlantis to specific ancestral homelands, claiming it as a precursor to their own civilization. These efforts were speculative and often ideologically motivated, yet they demonstrate how Atlantis could be adapted to serve contemporary narratives. The myth's ambiguity allowed it to be claimed without contradiction. Romanticism also softened resistance to speculative geography. While Enlightenment maps had narrowed the unknown world, Romantics delighted in imagining what lay beyond empirical reach. The ocean, vast and unfathomable, regained its symbolic power as a realm of secrets. Atlantis beneath the waves became plausible not because evidence demanded it, but because imagination required it. The sea was once again a keeper of memory, not merely a measurable space. Importantly, this era did not fully abandon scholarly debate. Some writers attempted to reconcile romantic intuition with emerging sciences. Geological discoveries revealed that Earth's history was far older and more violent than previously believed. Catastrophes such as volcanic eruptions, floods, and continental shifts gained scientific credibility. Although plate tectonics lay far in the future, the notion that landscapes could change dramatically over time gained acceptance. Atlantis, once dismissed as geologically impossible, seemed slightly less so. Yet this scientific openness also carried risk. Without rigorous standards, speculation flourished unchecked. Atlantis was increasingly linked to esoteric traditions, mystical energies, and hidden knowledge. These ideas appealed to romantic sensibilities, but moved the story further from historical grounding. Atlantis became a mirror reflecting cultural desires rather than a subject of disciplined inquiry. This shift ensured its popularity, but at the cost of clarity. By the mid-19th century, Atlantis occupied multiple roles simultaneously. It was a poetic symbol, a philosophical metaphor, a speculative historical hypothesis, and an object of mystical fascination. These interpretations often overlapped, reinforcing one another without resolving contradictions. The absence of evidence no longer weakened Atlantis. Instead, it enhanced its mystique. What could not be proven could still be felt. This re-enchanted Atlantis influenced how later generations approached ancient history. It encouraged the belief that the past held secrets deliberately concealed or accidentally forgotten. Lost civilizations became plausible explanations for unexplained monuments and cultural similarities. The groundwork was laid for more radical theories that would soon emerge, driven not by romantic poetry alone, but by attempts to systematize speculation into grand historical narratives. As Romanticism waned, its legacy endured. Atlantis had been restored to cultural prominence, not as a footnote to Plato, but as a powerful symbol embedded in Western imagination. The story had survived skepticism by transforming itself. It no longer depended on belief in its literal truth. Its value lay in its ability to express loss, wonder, and the limits of human knowledge. The next phase of Atlantis' history would push these ideas further, blending romantic longing with claims of scientific legitimacy. In the late 19th century, a new kind of thinker would attempt to prove Atlantis once and for all, reshaping the myth into a theory of global origins. This transition would mark one of the most influential and controversial chapters in the long life of Atlantis. The 19th century marked a decisive turning point in the history of Atlantis, when speculation hardened into assertion and imagination began to present itself as evidence. This was an age of extraordinary discovery. Archaeology uncovered ancient cities once thought mythical, geology revealed the immense age of the Earth, and evolutionary theory reshaped humanity's understanding of its own origins. In this climate of revelation, many believed that long-hidden truths were finally coming to light. Atlantis, dormant yet persistent, was drawn into this atmosphere of intellectual confidence and overreach. Unlike Romantic poets, 19th century writers often sought to prove Atlantis scientifically. They were not content to treat it as metaphor or moral allegory. Instead, they attempted to reconstruct it as a real civilization that had shaped global history. This effort reflected the era's faith in progress and classification, the belief that all phenomena, including myth, could be organized into coherent systems. Atlantis became a missing piece, a grand solution to unresolved questions about ancient monuments, cultural similarities, and the origins of civilization itself. The most influential figure in this transformation was Ignatius Donnelly, an American politician and writer whose 1882 book Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, profoundly shaped modern perceptions of the myth. Donnelly argued that Atlantis was a technologically advanced civilization destroyed by a catastrophic flood, and that its survivors spread knowledge across the world. According to him, Atlantis was the source of ancient Egypt, Mesoamerican civilizations, and even Old World mythologies. What earlier thinkers had treated cautiously, Donnelly presented with sweeping certainty. Donnelly's method blended selective scholarship with imaginative synthesis. He compared myths, architectural forms, symbols, and linguistic fragments from disparate cultures, interpreting similarities as evidence of a common Atlantean origin. Pyramids in Egypt and Mesoamerica, flood myths across continents, and shared motifs in art were all presented as proof of diffusion from a single lost source. In doing so, Donnelly echoed romantic ideas of primordial wisdom, but framed them within the language of comparative science. To 19th century readers, this approach was compelling. Archaeology was still young, and many ancient sites remained unexplained. The idea that a forgotten super-civilization had once unified human knowledge offered an elegant solution to complexity. Atlantis became a historical shortcut, explaining diversity through a single vanished origin. Donnelly's work sold widely and influenced both popular culture and fringe scholarship for generations. However, from a modern perspective, Donnelly's arguments were deeply flawed. He underestimated independent cultural development and overemphasized superficial similarities. His linguistic comparisons ignored established principles of language evolution. Most importantly, he lacked archaeological evidence. No artifacts, inscriptions, or stratified remains supported his claims. Yet the power of his narrative lay not in proof but in coherence. Atlantis became believable because it explained too much, not because it explained well. This period also coincided with imperial expansion and racial theories that shaped interpretations of ancient history. Some writers used Atlantis to argue for hierarchical models of civilization, suggesting that advanced knowledge must have originated from a superior ancestral culture. These ideas often carried implicit or explicit biases, projecting 19th century assumptions onto the distant past. Atlantis was recast as a civilizing force whose loss explained perceived decline elsewhere. The blending of Atlantis with flood narratives intensified during this time. Biblical stories, particularly that of Noah, were reinterpreted through geological catastrophe theories. Some writers proposed that Atlantis was destroyed by the same flood described in Scripture, reconciling religious tradition with speculative science. This synthesis appealed to audiences seeking harmony between faith and discovery. Atlantis became a bridge between sacred history and secular inquiry, though built on unstable foundations. Scientific institutions, meanwhile, grew increasingly critical. As archaeology advanced, civilizations once attributed to Atlantean influence were better understood in their own contexts. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Indus, and Mesoamerican cultures showed independent development over long periods. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphy, and systematic excavation undermined diffusionist models. Atlantis receded further from academic acceptance, but its popular appeal remained strong. The 19th century thus created a lasting divide. Within scholarly circles, Atlantis became an example of how not to interpret the past, a cautionary tale about confirmation bias and speculative excess. In popular culture, however, it gained unprecedented vitality. The image of a lost high civilization destroyed by catastrophe resonated deeply in an age witnessing rapid industrialization, social upheaval, and environmental transformation. Atlantis mirrored contemporary anxieties about progress and collapse. By the end of the century, Atlantis had been fundamentally reshaped. It was no longer primarily Plato's moral parable, nor the romantic symbol of loss alone. It had become a proto-historical theory, claiming to explain human origins on a global scale. This transformation ensured its persistence but also locked it into controversy. Atlantis now stood at the boundary between science and pseudoscience, a position it would occupy for much of the 20th century. As new technologies emerged and exploration reached deeper into oceans and deserts alike, Atlantis would once again be reevaluated. Some would seek it beneath the sea with instruments and expeditions. Others would incorporate it into spiritual and occult systems. The 19th century had given Atlantis a new identity, one both powerful and problematic. Its next evolution would reflect the tensions of a modern world grappling with evidence, belief, and the enduring allure of lost worlds. As the 20th century began, Atlantis entered one of its most distorted and controversial phases. The scientific community had largely dismissed it as literal history, yet the myth did not fade. Instead, it migrated into new intellectual and cultural spaces shaped by spiritual anxiety, ideological extremism, and fascination with hidden knowledge. Atlantis became detached from archaeology and philosophy and was reborn within occult systems and political fantasies that profoundly altered its meaning and legacy. This transformation was fueled by the collapse of 19th century certainties. Industrialization, urbanization, and rapid technological change created a sense that humanity had lost spiritual grounding. Traditional religious authority weakened, while science, though powerful, appeared unable to answer existential questions. In this vacuum, esoteric movements flourished, promising access to ancient wisdom concealed beneath the surface of modern life. Atlantis was readily absorbed into this environment, reimagined as the source of primordial spiritual truth. One of the most influential movements was Theosophy, founded in the late 19th century by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Drawing loosely on Eastern religions, Western mysticism, and speculative history, Theosophy presented Atlantis as a real prehistoric continent inhabited by spiritually advanced beings. According to Blavatsky, Atlanteans possessed psychic abilities and profound cosmic knowledge lost to modern humanity. Their destruction marked a decline from spiritual purity to material existence. This version of Atlantis bore little resemblance to Plato's moral allegory. It was not a warning about excess, but a lament for lost enlightenment. Theosophical Atlantis was embedded within a vast narrative of human evolution structured around root races, each representing a stage of spiritual development. Atlanteans occupied a central position in this schema, bridging earlier, more ethereal beings and later, more material humans. Although framed as universal spiritual history, these ideas often reflected racial hierarchies common in the era. Atlantis became entangled with notions of superiority and degeneration, concepts that would later be exploited in more dangerous forms. Occult interpretations spread widely through lectures, books, and secret societies. Atlantis appeared in spiritualist circles, claimed during seances, and referenced in automatic writings. It was said to exist on hidden plains or beneath polar ice, accessible only to initiates. These claims were immune to falsification, as they relied on revelation rather than evidence. Atlantis shifted further from history, becoming a metaphysical construct that validated belief systems rather than invited inquiry. At the same time, nationalist ideologies sought ancient origins to legitimize modern ambitions. In parts of Europe, particularly Germany, pseudo-historical theories emerged linking Atlantis to supposed ancestral homelands. Some writers claimed that Atlanteans were proto-Europeans whose descendants carried superior traits. These ideas blended poorly understood archaeology with racial mythology, transforming Atlantis into a political symbol. What had once warned against hubris was repurposed to justify domination. This ideological appropriation reached its most extreme expression under National Socialism. Certain figures within the Nazi regime showed interest in esoteric history, including distorted versions of Atlantis. Organizations such as the Ahnenerbe funded expeditions seeking evidence of ancient Aryan civilizations, though Atlantis itself was often displaced onto imagined northern continents like Thule or Hyperborea. While not central to Nazi doctrine, these myths contributed to a worldview that conflated mythic past with racial destiny. It is important to distinguish between fringe beliefs and official policy. Nazi Germany did not base its actions on Atlantis, yet the misuse of ancient myths to construct narratives of superiority illustrates how flexible and dangerous such stories can become when severed from critical analysis. Atlantis, stripped of philosophical context, became a vessel for projection, capable of serving almost any ideology. Outside Europe, Atlantis also influenced early 20th century alternative histories. Writers continued Donnelly's diffusionist approach, now supplemented by claims of advanced technology including crystal energy, flight, and even atomic power. These embellishments reflected contemporary technological anxieties. As humanity unlocked unprecedented destructive capabilities, the idea of a past civilization destroyed by its own power resonated deeply. Atlantis became a mirror for modern fears of self-annihilation. Mainstream scholarship responded by reinforcing disciplinary boundaries. Archaeology matured into a rigorous science, emphasizing stratigraphy, context, and verifiable evidence. Anthropologists demonstrated that cultural similarities could arise independently through shared human needs rather than diffusion from a single source. Geology explained ocean basins through tectonic processes incompatible with sunken continents. Within academia, Atlantis was no longer debated. It was excluded. Yet exclusion did not equal disappearance. Popular culture ensured Atlantis' survival. Early science fiction incorporated lost civilizations beneath the sea. Adventure novels depicted explorers uncovering submerged ruins. These stories rarely claimed truth, but they preserved the image of Atlantis as a technological marvel destroyed by catastrophe. Fiction succeeded where speculation failed, giving Atlantis narrative freedom without the burden of proof. By the mid-20th century, Atlantis existed in parallel worlds. In academia, it was a closed case, cited only as an example of myth or misinterpretation. In esoteric circles, it was a spiritual homeland. In extremist ideology, it was a corrupted symbol of imagined ancestry. In popular media, it was entertainment. Each version drew from fragments of Plato but reshaped them to serve different needs. This fragmentation marked a crucial stage in Atlantis' history. The myth had become untethered, no longer anchored to a single narrative or purpose. Its meaning depended entirely on who invoked it and why. The same story could inspire wonder, justify violence, or sell novels. Atlantis had become a cultural artifact rather than a historical claim. The devastation of 2 world wars altered perceptions once again. Faith in progress was shaken, and myths of superior civilizations lost credibility. The catastrophic potential of technology was no longer abstract. In this context, Atlantis regained an older resonance. The image of a powerful society destroyed by its own imbalance felt uncomfortably familiar. Yet now the lesson was modern, not ancient. As the 20th century progressed, new tools would emerge to explore Earth's past with unprecedented precision. Oceanography, satellite imaging, and underwater archaeology promised to illuminate regions once inaccessible. Atlantis would face another transformation, challenged not by ideology or mysticism, but by data. Whether this would finally end the story or merely reshape it once more remained to be seen. In the latter half of the 20th century, Atlantis entered a new phase defined not by philosophy, mysticism, or ideology, but by technology. Humanity acquired the ability to study the ocean floor systematically, transforming the sea from an opaque boundary into a mapped landscape. Advances in sonar, submersibles, satellite imaging, and marine geology allowed researchers to observe submerged terrain with unprecedented clarity. For the first time, the idea of a lost land beneath the ocean could be tested against physical evidence rather than speculation alone. This scientific turn did not signal a return of Atlantis to academic acceptance. On the contrary, most scholars regarded the myth as settled. Plate tectonics, developed in the mid-20th century, explained the formation of continents and ocean basins. According to this theory, continents do not suddenly sink. They move slowly over millions of years. The Atlantic Ocean itself was shown to be geologically young, formed by the gradual separation of tectonic plates. There was no mechanism by which a large island continent like Plato's Atlantis could have existed and then vanished within human timescales. Yet science also revealed something unexpected. Coastlines had not been static. During the last ice age, sea levels were significantly lower, exposing vast areas of land now submerged. As glaciers melted between roughly 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, rising seas flooded coastal plains worldwide. Entire landscapes were lost beneath the ocean, including human settlements. This discovery complicated the narrative. While Atlantis as described by Plato remained implausible, the broader idea of drowned lands was no longer mythical. It was demonstrably real. Underwater archaeology emerged as a discipline, uncovering submerged villages, harbors, and roads in regions once considered permanently marine. Off the coasts of Europe, Asia, and the Americas, evidence accumulated of prehistoric communities displaced by rising waters. These findings did not confirm Atlantis, but they explained why flood myths and lost land legends appeared across cultures. Human memory had preserved real experiences of inundation, encoded into mythic forms over generations. This context encouraged some researchers to revisit Plato's account with renewed nuance. Rather than searching for a vanished supercontinent, they considered whether Atlantis could represent a regional event exaggerated by time and retelling. Attention turned again to the Mediterranean, particularly the Aegean Sea. The Bronze Age eruption of Thera, which had destroyed much of the Minoan civilization, regained prominence. Its effects included earthquakes, tsunamis, ash fallout, and long-term societal disruption. Though separated by millennia from Plato's chronology, the scale of destruction matched his narrative more closely than any Atlantic hypothesis. Other researchers proposed different regional candidates. The Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, and submerged areas near the Strait of Gibraltar were examined for traces of ancient catastrophe. Geological surveys identified submerged river systems and plains that could once have supported human habitation. None, however, matched Plato's detailed description of concentric cities and imperial reach. Each hypothesis required selective reading of the text, reinforcing the conclusion that Plato's account could not be treated as straightforward geography. Public fascination, however, surged anew. Media coverage of underwater discoveries blurred the line between documented sites and speculative claims. Headlines invoked Atlantis whenever submerged ruins were found, regardless of scale or age. The name carried symbolic weight, attracting attention even when inappropriate. Atlantis had become shorthand for any drowned civilization, diluting its original specificity while expanding its cultural reach. In this era, amateur explorers and independent researchers launched expeditions explicitly seeking Atlantis. Some focused on the Bahamas, pointing to underwater formations such as the so-called Bimini Road, a line of stones interpreted by some as a man-made structure. Geological analysis demonstrated that these features were natural formations shaped by erosion and fracturing. Nevertheless, the persistence of such claims highlighted a recurring pattern. When evidence contradicted desire, desire often prevailed. Academic responses grew firmer. Archaeologists emphasized methodological rigor, warning against interpreting natural formations as ruins without contextual evidence. They stressed that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Atlantis, they argued, remained unsupported by material culture. No inscriptions, tools, or architectural remains existed that could be reliably dated and attributed to such a civilization. The myth, while culturally significant, had no archaeological footprint. Yet the scientific study of ancient climate and sea level change enriched understanding of why Atlantis had endured. Plato's date of 9,000 years before Solon coincided roughly with the end of the last ice age, a time of dramatic environmental transformation. While his chronology was inaccurate by historical standards, it aligned symbolically with a real period of upheaval. The memory of drowned landscapes may have survived in oral traditions, later rationalized into a single narrative of loss. Modern scholars increasingly interpreted Atlantis as a composite myth. It drew on multiple sources: memories of floods, observations of distant lands, philosophical ideals, and political allegory. Plato synthesized these elements into a story that served his purposes. The power of the myth lay not in factual precision, but in narrative integration. Atlantis was believable because it resonated with real experiences, even if its details were invented. By the end of the 20th century, Atlantis occupied a stable position within scholarship. It was acknowledged as an influential myth rooted in specific historical contexts. Its afterlife in later centuries was studied as a case of cultural transmission and reinterpretation. The focus shifted from asking where Atlantis was to asking why people continued to search for it. This question opened new avenues of inquiry into human psychology, memory, and the need for origin stories. At the same time, technology continued to advance. Satellite mapping revealed previously unknown underwater features. Deep sea exploration expanded knowledge of the ocean floor. Each discovery prompted renewed speculation, even as it reinforced geological models incompatible with Atlantis as Plato described it. The myth persisted not because science failed, but because it addressed questions science could not fully answer. Questions of meaning, loss, and the fate of civilizations. Atlantis had survived reason, ideology, and evidence. Now it existed alongside science, not as a rival explanation, but as a parallel narrative. It was no longer sought by serious researchers as a physical place, yet it continued to inspire exploration, fiction, and reflection. The ocean, once feared as a destroyer of worlds, had become a subject of study, yet its depths still concealed mysteries enough to sustain imagination. As the new millennium approached, Atlantis faced another transformation. Digital media, global communication, and renewed interest in ancient history would carry the myth into new forms. The question was no longer whether Atlantis could be found, but how it would be remembered in an age where the past was increasingly accessible, yet meaning remained elusive. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Atlantis entered an era unlike any before it. The digital age transformed how information was created, shared, and consumed. Myths no longer passed slowly through manuscripts or academic debate, but circulated instantly across global networks. In this environment, Atlantis did not fade under the weight of scientific consensus. Instead, it multiplied. The story fractured into countless versions, each adapted to the needs, fears, and imaginations of a connected world hungry for mystery. The rise of the internet dissolved traditional gatekeeping of knowledge. Scholarly articles, speculative essays, documentaries, and personal theories appeared side by side, often without clear distinction. For many readers, Atlantis existed simultaneously as philosophical allegory, lost civilization, extraterrestrial colony, and metaphor for climate collapse. Contradiction no longer weakened the myth. It strengthened it by allowing every audience to claim a version that felt personally meaningful. Popular culture played a central role in this reinvention. Films, television series, video games, and novels reimagined Atlantis repeatedly. Sometimes it appeared as a technologically advanced underwater city, sustained by ancient machines. At other times it was depicted as a tragic kingdom frozen in time, waiting to be rediscovered. These portrayals rarely referenced Plato directly. Instead, they drew from the accumulated imagery of centuries, blending science fiction, fantasy, and archaeology into a single aesthetic. Atlantis became visually defined even as its historical definition dissolved. This era also witnessed a renewed fascination with lost civilizations as a genre. Alongside Atlantis appeared Lemuria, Mu, and other hypothetical lands. The appeal lay not in plausibility but in narrative satisfaction. Such stories offered escape from a world mapped and measured to exhaustion. They suggested that wonder still existed beyond official knowledge, hidden beneath oceans or ice. Atlantis thrived because it represented the possibility that something immense had been overlooked. Documentaries and pseudo-documentaries blurred lines further. Programs framed speculative claims with the language of investigation, presenting questions as evidence and uncertainty as revelation. Advanced graphics recreated submerged cities, lending visual authority to unproven ideas. Viewers encountered Atlantis not as myth, but as unresolved mystery. This presentation reinforced belief without requiring proof, appealing to intuition over methodology. At the same time, legitimate scientific concerns began to echo Atlantean themes. Climate change, rising sea levels, and coastal vulnerability revived the relevance of drowned landscapes. Modern cities faced threats once confined to legend. In this context, Atlantis was no longer merely a lost past. It became a warning for the future. The image of a powerful civilization undone by environmental forces resonated strongly in an age of accelerating ecological instability. Scholars observed this shift with caution. While Atlantis remained unsupported as historical fact, its symbolic relevance intensified. Academics in literature, philosophy, and cultural studies examined why the myth persisted so powerfully. They argued that Atlantis functioned as a cultural memory device, allowing societies to process anxiety about impermanence. The myth survived because it articulated a fear that data alone could not resolve, that complexity and power do not guarantee survival. Digital communities further reshaped the narrative. Online forums and social media allowed individuals to collaborate on speculative reconstructions, combining satellite images, ancient texts, and personal interpretation. Some participants treated this as creative exploration, others as serious research. The distinction often blurred. Atlantis became participatory, no longer authored by a single philosopher or theorist, but collectively rewritten in real time. This democratization of myth had consequences. On one hand, it kept Atlantis alive, adaptable, and culturally relevant. On the other, it diluted historical literacy. Plato's original context was frequently lost, replaced by fragments quoted out of sequence. Egyptian priests, Solon, and ancient Athens faded into the background, while crystal technologies and alien engineers took center stage. Atlantis became unmoored from its origins, floating freely through digital imagination. Yet even this detachment revealed something enduring. Atlantis proved resilient because it was never just about geography. Its core was narrative structure: rise, excess, warning, collapse, loss. This structure mapped easily onto modern concerns. Corporations, empires, ecosystems, and technologies could all be cast as Atlantean. The myth offered a language for decline without requiring prophecy. In educational contexts, Atlantis found new purpose. Teachers used it to illustrate the difference between myth and history, encouraging critical thinking. By examining how Atlantis had been interpreted across centuries, students learned how narratives evolve and how evidence is evaluated. In this way, Atlantis became a tool rather than a claim, valuable precisely because it could not be proven. As artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and immersive media advanced, Atlantis entered experiential storytelling. Users could explore simulated ruins beneath digital seas, walking through imagined streets based loosely on Plato's description. These experiences did not assert truth. They offered immersion. Atlantis became a place one could visit emotionally, if not physically. The boundary between myth and memory blurred further. Despite all transformations, the scholarly consensus remained unchanged. Atlantis, as described by Plato, did not exist as a literal empire. No discovery overturned that conclusion. What changed was the relevance of the question itself. In a world overwhelmed by information, Atlantis mattered not because it might be found, but because it reflected how humans relate to the past. The digital age did not resolve Atlantis. It ensured its permanence. The myth adapted seamlessly to new platforms, new fears, and new hopes. It no longer needed belief to survive, it needed only attention. As long as civilizations worried about their own fragility, Atlantis would remain nearby, submerged just below awareness, waiting to be rediscovered again and again in new forms. Thus, Atlantis entered the modern world not as a destination, but as a mirror. Its waters reflected humanity's changing relationship with knowledge, power, and loss. The myth had outlived empires, ideologies, and sciences. What remained was not the question of where Atlantis lay, but why the story refused to sink. In the long aftermath of debate, dismissal, and reinvention, Atlantis gradually assumed a quieter but deeper role within human thought. No longer pursued seriously as a geographical target, it became something more abstract and enduring, a memory of loss without a clear object, a metaphor flexible enough to cross cultures and centuries. Atlantis endured because it adapted to the needs of each era, not by proving itself real, but by remaining meaningful. In this phase of its history, Atlantis ceased to belong to archaeologists or mystics alone and became a shared symbolic language for civilization itself. At its core, the Atlantean story reflects a pattern deeply embedded in human experience. Societies rise through cooperation, ingenuity, and favorable conditions. Prosperity follows, bringing confidence and expansion. Over time, restraint weakens, inequality grows, and systems become brittle. Collapse arrives not always through invasion, but through imbalance, environmental stress, or internal decay. Atlantis condenses this long, complex process into a single, unforgettable image, a powerful city disappearing beneath the sea. The image persists because it captures truth at the level of pattern rather than fact. Modern historical analysis increasingly emphasizes cycles rather than linear progress. Empires expand and contract, technologies advance and create new vulnerabilities, and environments respond to human pressure. Within this framework, Atlantis reads less like fantasy and more like allegory refined to its purest form. Plato's narrative, though philosophically motivated, anticipated later understandings of systemic risk. He framed collapse as the consequence of moral and structural imbalance, not random misfortune. This framing resonates strongly in a world confronting the limits of growth. Memory plays a central role in this endurance. Atlantis represents not only a lost place, but lost knowledge and lost warning. In Plato's telling, Greece forgot its ancient past due to repeated disasters. This theme echoes modern concerns about historical amnesia. Civilizations often fail to learn from predecessors because records are lost, ignored, or dismissed. Atlantis stands as the ultimate forgotten lesson, preserved only in fragmentary form, always just beyond reach. Its elusiveness mirrors humanity's difficulty in retaining hard-earned wisdom across generations. The sea itself enhances this symbolism. Water erases boundaries, dissolves structures, and conceals evidence. A civilization destroyed by fire leaves ruins. One destroyed by water leaves absence. Atlantis vanishes without trace, reinforcing the idea that even the most elaborate achievements can be undone completely. This notion unsettles modern assumptions about permanence. Concrete, steel, and data feel enduring, yet Atlantis reminds us that context, not material, determines survival. In cultural studies, Atlantis is often described as a myth of totality. Unlike localized legends, it claims global significance. It explains origins, decline, and dispersal. This breadth allows it to absorb new meanings without contradiction. It can represent ecological collapse, technological overreach, imperial arrogance, or spiritual loss. Each interpretation selects different elements while retaining the central image of submergence. Atlantis survives because it is structurally incomplete, inviting participation rather than closure. The myth also reflects tension between hubris and humility. Atlanteans were not portrayed as evil, but as gradually corrupted by success. Their downfall was not sudden madness, but accumulated excess. This nuance distinguishes Atlantis from simpler moral tales. It acknowledges that collapse often emerges from strengths pushed too far. Intelligence becomes arrogance, organization becomes rigidity, power becomes blindness. These themes resonate strongly in complex societies where failure rarely has a single cause. In environmental discourse, Atlantis has acquired renewed relevance. Rising seas threaten coastal cities, echoing ancient inundations. Entire communities face displacement, mirroring the loss at the heart of the Atlantean story. Here, Atlantis is not prophecy, but precedent. It reminds us that environmental change has shaped human destiny before and will do so again. The difference lies in awareness. Unlike Atlanteans, modern societies possess scientific foresight. Whether that knowledge leads to restraint remains uncertain. Philosophically, Atlantis challenges the relationship between myth and truth. It demonstrates that a story need not be factual to be instructive. Plato never presented Atlantis as history in the modern sense. He embedded it within dialogue, inviting reflection rather than belief. The later obsession with proving or disproving its existence may miss this intention. Atlantis functions best not as an object to be found, but as a lens through which to examine values. Education increasingly reflects this perspective. Rather than asking students whether Atlantis existed, instructors explore why the question persists. The myth becomes a case study in how narratives shape understanding of the past. It illustrates how authority, translation, ideology, and desire influence interpretation. In this role, Atlantis remains active, provoking inquiry rather than demanding resolution. Across cultures, analogous myths reinforce its universality. Stories of sunken lands, lost capitals, and drowned ancestors appear worldwide. While independent, they share emotional architecture. Each expresses grief for a vanished world and anxiety about repetition. Atlantis occupies a prominent place among them because it was articulated with unusual clarity and preserved through a continuous textual tradition. Its survival owes as much to Plato's literary skill as to the story's content. In contemporary literature and art, Atlantis often appears indirectly. Authors depict societies that collapse through technological excess or ecological neglect without naming the ancient island. The pattern is recognizable even when the reference is not explicit. Atlantis has become a narrative template, embedded so deeply that it no longer requires citation. It operates beneath the surface of storytelling, shaping expectations of rise and fall. This invisibility marks maturity rather than decline. Myths that endure eventually dissolve into cultural DNA. They stop being told as stories and start being used as structures. Atlantis has reached this stage. Its name still carries power, but its deeper influence lies in how it frames collapse as comprehensible and avoidable, yet tragically common. In this sense, Atlantis remains unfinished. Its meaning evolves as circumstances change. It absorbed fears of imperial decline in antiquity, anxieties about discovery in the Renaissance, doubts about progress in the modern age, and concerns about sustainability today. Each era adds a layer without erasing the previous ones. Atlantis accumulates meaning like sediment, growing richer through reinterpretation. The myth endures because it addresses a fundamental uncertainty. Humans build with the hope of permanence, yet history suggests impermanence is the rule. Atlantis does not resolve this tension. It gives it form. It allows societies to contemplate their own fragility without immediate confrontation. In doing so, it performs a vital psychological function, transforming fear into narrative. Thus, Atlantis survives not beneath the sea, but within collective imagination. It is not a place waiting to be uncovered, but a story waiting to be understood anew. Its history is not confined to the past. It unfolds wherever civilizations question their direction and fate. In this way, Atlantis remains present not as lost land, but as enduring reminder. As the story of Atlantis moved further into the 21st century, a quiet shift occurred in how the search itself was understood. The question was no longer framed simply as whether Atlantis could be found, but whether it should be sought at all. Advances in technology had given humanity unprecedented access to the planet's surface and depths. Satellites mapped coastlines in fine detail, sonar traced the contours of the ocean floor. Archaeology became increasingly precise, guided by data rather than chance. Yet the more the world was measured, the less space remained for Atlantis as a literal destination. This narrowing did not end exploration. Instead, it redirected it. Researchers turned their attention to understanding how ancient peoples imagined space, memory, and catastrophe. Atlantis became a case study in the limits of discovery, illustrating that not every powerful story corresponds to a recoverable site. Some truths exist not as objects buried in sediment, but as ideas embedded in culture. The search for Atlantis thus evolved into an inquiry about how humans remember, forget, and reconstruct their past. Technological optimism once promised that nothing would remain hidden forever. Deep-sea exploration vehicles descended into trenches once thought unreachable. Submerged ruins were discovered off coasts long known to fishermen but never studied closely. These findings fueled brief resurgences of Atlantean excitement. Each new anomaly seemed to offer possibility. Yet time and again, closer examination revealed familiar explanations. Nature and human history proved complex enough without invoking a vanished supercontinent. This pattern reinforced an important lesson. Absence of evidence did not merely weaken claims about Atlantis, it clarified the boundaries between myth and material history. Archaeology thrived precisely because it accepted limits. It relied on context, stratigraphy, and continuity rather than spectacle. Atlantis, by contrast, resisted context. Its scale and sudden disappearance conflicted with everything known about how societies leave traces behind. The ocean preserves as much as it destroys, and no sign of a civilization matching Plato's description ever emerged. Despite this, the desire to search endured. It persisted not because of ignorance, but because of longing. Atlantis symbolized a hope that the past might still surprise us, that modern knowledge was incomplete in meaningful ways. The myth offered a reminder that certainty can feel sterile. In chasing Atlantis, people were often chasing wonder itself, the emotional experience of standing at the edge of the unknown. This longing revealed something essential about human curiosity. Exploration is not driven solely by practical outcomes, it is sustained by narrative. From ancient voyages to modern space missions, humanity has always framed discovery as story. Atlantis fit naturally into this tradition. It promised a revelation dramatic enough to reframe history. Even when reason rejected the promise, imagination kept it alive. Scholars increasingly acknowledge this psychological dimension. They argued that myths like Atlantis serve as motivational engines for inquiry. Even false premises can inspire real investigation. Early oceanography benefited indirectly from Atlantean fascination, as interest in submerged lands encouraged funding and attention. In this sense, Atlantis contributed to knowledge not by being found, but by being sought. Yet there were ethical considerations. Some critics warned that obsessive focus on Atlantis distracted from genuine heritage preservation. Real ancient sites faced neglect, while imaginary ones consumed attention. The romantic pull of Atlantis sometimes overshadowed the quieter stories of civilizations whose remains still lay vulnerable. This tension highlighted the responsibility that accompanies storytelling. Myths can inspire, but they can also distort priorities. Gradually, a more balanced perspective emerged. Atlantis was acknowledged as a powerful cultural artifact rather than a research target. Conferences and publications explored its influence across philosophy, politics, and art without asserting its physical reality. This reframing allowed Atlantis to be studied seriously without being chased fruitlessly. It reclaimed the myth as an object of analysis rather than belief. In this context, the limits of discovery became clearer. Not every question yields to excavation. Some answers reside in interpretation rather than recovery. Atlantis taught that history is not only what happened, but what is remembered, imagined, and retold. The discipline of history depends on evidence, but culture depends on meaning. Atlantis occupies the space between these domains. The enduring search thus transformed into reflection. Instead of asking where Atlantis was, thinkers asked why Plato created it, why later generations clung to it, and what needs it fulfilled. These questions proved more productive than any expedition. They revealed how societies used the past to negotiate identity, morality, and destiny. In the end, Atlantis resisted closure. No discovery confirmed it, and no argument fully erased it. This unresolved state became part of its function. Atlantis remained a horizon, always visible, never reached. It reminded humanity that knowledge has edges, and that beyond those edges lie stories that guide as much as they mislead. As technology continued to advance, the lesson endured. The world could be mapped in extraordinary detail, yet meaning could not be extracted by instruments alone. Atlantis survived as proof that some narratives outlast the conditions that produce them. They persist because they speak to enduring questions about loss, ambition, and the fate of civilizations. Thus, the search for Atlantis reached its most mature phase, not when it ended, but when it changed direction. It turned inward, examining the human impulse to seek vanished worlds. In doing so, it revealed that the greatest discoveries are sometimes not found beneath the sea, but within the stories we refuse to let go. This inward turn did not signal resignation. Rather, it marked a deeper engagement with the nature of historical understanding. Atlantis highlighted the difference between explanation and meaning. Explanation relies on causality and evidence, assembling fragments into coherent accounts. Meaning arises from resonance, from the way stories align with human experience. Atlantis excelled at the latter. It offered a narrative shape that explanation alone could not provide, especially when confronting themes of loss and impermanence. Historians observed that every civilization constructs stories of origin and decline. These narratives anchor identity and warn against excess. Atlantis, though external to any single culture, functioned as a shared parable. It allowed societies to externalize fear of downfall without directly accusing themselves. By projecting collapse onto a distant legendary other, communities could examine vulnerability at a safe remove. This mechanism became particularly visible during periods of rapid change. As globalization accelerated and technological systems grew increasingly interconnected, the possibility of systemic failure loomed larger. Atlantis returned repeatedly in discourse about resilience and risk. It appeared in metaphors describing financial crises, infrastructure breakdowns, and environmental tipping points. The name carried immediate weight, compressing complex processes into a single image of submergence. In this way, Atlantis continued to evolve without acquiring new facts. Its adaptability demonstrated that myths do not depend on accumulation of evidence, but on relevance. When relevance fades, myths fade. Atlantis endured because its central concern, the fragility of achievement, never lost urgency. Each generation reinterpreted the story through its own anxieties, ensuring continuity without repetition. The limits of discovery thus became a form of knowledge. Recognizing that Atlantis would not be found allowed scholars to redirect energy toward understanding how myths function across time. Comparative studies trace similarities between Atlantean narratives and other cultural collapse myths, revealing shared structures. These patterns suggested that Atlantis was less an anomaly than a refined expression of a universal storytelling impulse. This recognition also softened earlier conflicts between believers and skeptics. The debate shifted from confrontation to coexistence. Atlantis could be appreciated aesthetically and intellectually without demanding assent. The myth occupied a legitimate space within cultural history, distinct from empirical claims. This separation reduced the need to defend or attack its literal existence. As a result, Atlantis entered a phase of quiet stability. It no longer surged with sensational claims nor retreated into obscurity. It remained present, referenced with awareness of its symbolic nature. This balance allowed the myth to function sustainably within modern thought, neither dominating nor disappearing. The enduring search for Atlantis thus concluded not with discovery but with understanding. Humanity learned that some quests transform the seeker more than the sought. Atlantis offered insight into how stories guide exploration, how imagination shapes inquiry, and how limits define wisdom. Its legacy lay not beneath the ocean, but within the ongoing dialogue between past and present. In accepting these limits, the story achieved a rare completeness. It remained open enough to invite reflection, yet grounded enough to resist illusion. Atlantis stood as a testament to the power of narrative to survive scrutiny without surrendering mystery. It reminded humanity that the past is not only a record to be recovered, but a mirror through which the present is examined. Thus, Atlantis continued its journey, not across seas, but across minds. Its history expanded not through excavation, but through interpretation. The myth endured because it addressed questions that no discovery could settle. Questions about how civilizations understand themselves at the moment they fear becoming memories. These questions remain unanswered, sustaining Atlantis within thought. As humanity moved deeper into the 21st century, Atlantis became increasingly intertwined with modern civilizational anxiety. The myth no longer functioned primarily as a question of ancient geography or philosophical allegory. Instead, it evolved into a lens through which contemporary societies examined their own trajectory. The story's endurance revealed less about the ancient world and more about the present one. Atlantis became a warning replayed endlessly, not because it predicted disaster, but because it articulated fear with unsettling clarity. Modern civilization is defined by unprecedented scale. Cities house tens of millions, economies span continents, and systems depend on fragile interconnections. This complexity generates prosperity, but also vulnerability. A disruption in one region can cascade globally. In this context, Atlantis resonates as a compressed narrative of systemic collapse. Its sudden disappearance mirrors fears of abrupt failure, whether through climate change, technological breakdown, or political fragmentation. The myth condenses diffuse anxieties into a single, comprehensible image. Climate change in particular revived Atlantean symbolism with new urgency. Rising seas transformed the idea of submergence from metaphor into measurable threat. Coastal cities faced projections of flooding within decades. Island nations confronted the possibility of erasure. For the first time, the fate of Atlantis no longer seemed distant or hypothetical. It echoed within scientific reports and policy debates. The image of a civilization claimed by water acquired an unsettling immediacy. Yet Atlantis differs from modern scenarios in a crucial way. Plato framed destruction as moral consequence, while contemporary analysis emphasizes systems and feedback loops. Despite this difference, the emotional impact remains similar. Both narratives confront the idea that success can generate conditions for downfall. Atlantis thus bridges ancient moral reasoning and modern systemic thinking. It allows ethical reflection without denying scientific causality. Technological dependence introduced another layer of relevance. Advanced societies rely on infrastructure invisible to most citizens. Electricity, data networks, and supply chains sustain daily life, yet their fragility is rarely acknowledged. Atlantis symbolizes the illusion of permanence that accompanies technological mastery. The Atlanteans believed themselves secure until collapse arrived suddenly and completely. This pattern echoes modern concerns about overconfidence in innovation. In literature and media, this anxiety found expression through dystopian narratives that parallel the Atlantean arc. Stories depicted advanced societies undone by their own creations, whether artificial intelligence, environmental neglect, or social inequality. These fictional worlds often avoided explicit reference to Atlantis, yet their structure mirrored it precisely. Rise, excess, collapse, silence. Atlantis became the unspoken ancestor of modern dystopia. Philosophers and sociologists noted this continuity. They argued that Atlantis represents a civilizational self-critique embedded within Western thought. Unlike myths that glorify conquest or destiny, Atlantis centers on failure. It acknowledges limits and consequences. This makes it particularly suited to moments when confidence wanes and reflection deepens. The myth surfaces most strongly when progress feels precarious. Political discourse also absorbed Atlantean language. Commentators warned of nations becoming modern Atlanteans, wealthy yet complacent, powerful yet blind to long-term risk. Such rhetoric transformed Atlantis into a cautionary label, shorthand for decline born of arrogance. While often exaggerated, this usage demonstrated the myth's rhetorical power. Few stories conveyed vulnerability so efficiently. At the same time, critics cautioned against fatalism. They argued that invoking Atlantis too readily could foster resignation rather than responsibility. If collapse is framed as inevitable, action loses urgency. Plato's Atlantis was destroyed by divine judgment, a force beyond human control. Modern collapse, by contrast, remains shaped by choice. The challenge lay in using the myth to inspire prevention rather than acceptance. This tension defined Atlantis' modern role. It hovered between warning and prophecy. Used thoughtfully, it encouraged humility and foresight. Used carelessly, it reinforced despair. The myth's ambiguity allowed both outcomes. This duality reflected the uncertainty of the age itself, caught between unprecedented capability and mounting risk. Education systems began engaging Atlantis within this framework. Rather than treating it solely as ancient myth, instructors explored its relevance to sustainability, ethics, and governance. Students analyzed how narratives influence perception of risk. Atlantis became a case study in how stories shape collective imagination and decision-making. The myth thus entered practical discourse, not as fact, but as conceptual tool. In psychology, Atlantis was examined as an archetype of loss. Carl Jung and later thinkers had emphasized collective unconscious patterns, and Atlantis fit naturally within this tradition. It represented the fear of regression, the terror that progress might not be cumulative. Beneath rational planning lay an emotional awareness that complexity can unravel. Atlantis gave that awareness form. This archetypal dimension explained the myth's persistence across cultures and ideologies. Whether secular or religious, capitalist or socialist, societies recognized the pattern. Atlantis transcended belief systems because it addressed structural vulnerability rather than specific doctrine. It did not require faith, only recognition of fragility. As humanity expanded beyond Earth, even space exploration absorbed Atlantean undertones. Discussions of planetary sustainability referenced Earth as potentially becoming a drowned or ruined world if mismanaged. Mars and other destinations were framed not as escapes, but as mirrors reflecting Earth's fate. Atlantis thus extended its reach beyond oceans, becoming a planetary metaphor. Despite these transformations, Atlantis retained its distance. It remained ancient, unnamed in many applications, its origins often forgotten. This detachment allowed flexible use without historical constraint. Yet scholars continued to trace its lineage, reminding audiences that the myth emerged from specific philosophical concerns in classical Greece. This grounding prevented total abstraction, anchoring Atlantis within intellectual history. The myth's endurance highlighted an essential truth. Civilizations do not only fear destruction, they fear forgetting. Atlantis embodies both. It is destroyed and nearly erased, surviving only through fragile transmission. This dual loss resonates deeply in an age of digital abundance, where information persists yet meaning feels unstable. Atlantis warns that preservation without understanding is insufficient. Thus, Atlantis became less about the past than about continuity. It asked whether modern societies could transmit wisdom effectively, or whether knowledge would fragment under pressure. Plato's warning about forgotten histories gained new relevance as information overload threatened coherence. Atlantis symbolized the danger of knowing everything except what matters. In this stage of its history, Atlantis no longer needed advocates or detractors. It functioned independently, woven into the fabric of cultural reflection. Its power lay not in claims of truth, but in its capacity to frame uncertainty. It offered a narrative space where fear, responsibility, and hope could coexist without resolution. Atlantis endured because it did not promise salvation. It offered awareness. It did not predict collapse. It reminded civilizations that collapse is possible. This reminder proved invaluable in an era defined by scale and speed. As humanity confronted challenges without precedent, Atlantis stood quietly in the background, a submerged silhouette against the future. The myth thus reached a new maturity. No longer a destination to be found, it became a companion to thought, accompanying discussions of progress with a shadow of consequence. Atlantis survived because it evolved with civilization, reflecting each age's deepest concerns. In doing so, it confirmed that the most powerful myths are those that change without disappearing. As modern civilization advanced, Atlantis remained unchanged at its core. A city lost to water, remembered imperfectly, warning without commanding. Its silence spoke volumes. It asked a question no era could fully answer. Not whether Atlantis existed, but whether any civilization can escape its fate. As humanity looked increasingly toward the future, Atlantis began to occupy a paradoxical position in cultural consciousness. It was at once ancient and forward-looking, rooted in classical philosophy yet persistently invoked in discussions about what lay ahead. The myth's survival into an age of advanced science, predictive modeling, and global planning revealed something unexpected. Progress had not eliminated the need for cautionary stories. Instead, it had intensified it. Atlantis became a narrative anchor at the edge of the future, reminding civilization that foresight without wisdom can still lead to ruin. Future studies, an interdisciplinary field combining science, economics, and social theory, often grappled with scenarios of collapse and resilience. Though rarely named explicitly, Atlantis hovered behind many of these models. Analysts spoke of tipping points, thresholds, and irreversible change. These concepts echoed the sudden downfall described by Plato. The language had evolved, but the structure remained familiar. A system stable for generations could fail rapidly once critical limits were crossed. What distinguished modern thought from ancient myth was agency. Where Atlantis fell by divine will, future collapse was framed as human-driven. Decisions about energy use, governance, and technological deployment shaped outcomes. Yet the emotional weight of Atlantis persisted because it dramatized consequence in a way charts could not. It transformed abstract risk into a story of loss, one that could be felt rather than calculated. Artificial intelligence and automation introduced new dimensions to this dialogue. As systems grew capable of self-optimization, concerns emerged about loss of control. Scholars warned that complexity could exceed human comprehension, creating vulnerabilities invisible until failure occurred. Atlantis symbolized this danger elegantly. The Atlanteans were not ignorant, they were advanced. Their downfall suggested that intelligence alone does not guarantee stability. Alignment, restraint, and ethical grounding mattered just as much. In speculative futures, Atlantis sometimes reappeared not as victim but as origin. Writers imagined descendants of Atlanteans seeding other civilizations or preserving knowledge in hidden forms. These narratives inverted the original tragedy, transforming loss into continuity. While fictional, they reflected a deeper hope. That even if civilizations fall, something endures. Atlantis thus became a bridge between despair and optimism, offering the possibility that collapse need not mean absolute erasure. This duality shaped its role in futurist ethics. Some thinkers argued that Atlantis warned against unchecked ambition, advocating humility and precaution. Others saw it as evidence that progress must be paired with adaptability. The myth did not prescribe solutions, but it framed the stakes. It asked whether humanity could learn fast enough to avoid repeating patterns embedded in history. The digital preservation of knowledge intensified this question. Modern civilization records unprecedented amounts of data, yet its longevity remains uncertain. Formats become obsolete, infrastructures decay, and access depends on continuity of power and governance. Atlantis' near total disappearance highlighted the fragility of transmission. It raised uncomfortable questions about whether future societies would understand the present, or whether modern achievements would dissolve into incomprehensible remnants. This concern resonated strongly in discussions about long-term thinking. Initiatives aimed at safeguarding knowledge across millennia referenced ancient losses as cautionary examples. Atlantis, though mythical, symbolized the extreme outcome of cultural discontinuity. It reinforced the idea that preservation requires intentional design, not passive accumulation. Memory once lost is rarely recovered intact. In this way, Atlantis influenced future-oriented philosophy without asserting literal truth. It functioned as a stress test for civilizational planning. If even the most advanced society could vanish, what safeguards mattered most? Physical defenses proved insufficient. What endured were values, adaptability, and mechanisms for learning from failure. Atlantis underscored that resilience is cultural as much as technological. Space exploration added another layer. As humanity contemplated becoming a multi-planetary species, Atlantis served as a reminder that expansion does not eliminate risk. A civilization capable of reaching the stars could still collapse at home. Some commentators described Earth itself as a potential Atlantis in waiting, vulnerable despite its achievements. This framing emphasized stewardship over escape, responsibility over ambition. The myth also influenced artistic visions of the future. Architecture, visual arts, and literature often depicted ruins of advanced societies reclaimed by nature. These images echoed Atlantean submergence, blending beauty with warning. They suggested that time ultimately reasserts itself over human constructs. Atlantis thus became part of a broader aesthetic of impermanence, shaping how the future imagined its own past. In political philosophy, Atlantis reinforced skepticism toward utopian promises. Plato's account contrasted Atlantis with an idealized Athens, implying that power without virtue leads to decay. Modern readers applied this lesson to ideologies claiming inevitable progress. Atlantis reminded them that systems fail not only because of external shocks, but because of internal contradictions left unexamined. This caution did not negate hope. On the contrary, Atlantis' continued relevance implied that awareness of vulnerability can inspire better choices. The myth survived because it invited reflection rather than resignation. It did not claim that collapse was unavoidable, only that it was possible. This distinction proved crucial for future-oriented thinking, where motivation depends on belief in agency. As artificial environments, virtual worlds, and simulated societies became more sophisticated, Atlantis even entered experimental design. Researchers created models of complex systems to study collapse dynamics, sometimes referencing historical and mythical precedents. Atlantis provided a narrative shorthand for sudden systemic failure, helping communicate findings beyond technical audiences. Myth and model intersected in unexpected ways. Through all these transformations, Atlantis retained its silence. It offered no instructions, only implication. Its power lay in restraint. Unlike prophetic myths, it did not dictate destiny. It merely demonstrated consequence. This openness allowed each generation to reinterpret it according to emerging challenges. Atlantis remained relevant because it did not compete with the future. It accompanied it. As humanity approached thresholds unprecedented in scale and speed, Atlantis stood as a companion story, ancient yet uncannily aligned with modern concerns. It reminded civilization that greatness does not immunize against loss, that complexity demands humility, and that survival depends on more than strength. These lessons were not new, but their repetition underscored their importance. Thus, Atlantis reached the edge of the future not as a relic, but as a living narrative. Its history extended beyond antiquity into speculative tomorrow, not by changing its form, but by deepening its meaning. The myth endured because it addressed questions that science alone could not resolve: how to balance ambition with restraint, progress with memory, power with wisdom. In this role, Atlantis became less a story about what was lost and more a question about what might be preserved. It asked whether humanity could recognize warning signs embedded in its own myths. It invited reflection on whether knowledge would translate into foresight, or whether history, real or imagined, would repeat itself once more. Standing at the edge of the future, Atlantis did not predict the end. It illuminated the stakes. It whispered that civilizations are judged not only by what they build, but by what they choose to protect. In that whisper lay its enduring relevance, carrying the ancient story forward into uncertain horizons. At the end of its long journey through human thought, Atlantis arrives not as an answer, but as a final question. After centuries of interpretation, rejection, revival, and transformation, the myth stands stripped of illusion yet heavy with meaning. It no longer asks to be believed in a literal sense, it asks to be understood. In this final phase of its history, Atlantis becomes a measure by which civilizations judge themselves, a quiet standard against which ambition, memory, and responsibility are weighed. Atlantis began as a story told within a philosophical dialogue, shaped by Plato to explore virtue, power, and moral decline. Over time, it escaped its textual origin and entered collective imagination. It was chased across oceans, embedded in esoteric systems, misused by ideologies, revived by popular culture, and reframed by modern anxiety. Each transformation revealed more about the societies interpreting it than about any ancient island. By surviving all these changes, Atlantis demonstrated an essential truth about myth. Its durability lies not in factual accuracy, but in interpretive flexibility. What remains striking at this endpoint is how little the core narrative has changed. A powerful civilization rises, loses balance, and disappears suddenly, leaving only fragments of memory. This structure has proven endlessly applicable. It has outlived empires, religions, and scientific revolutions. Even in an age that demands evidence and verification, Atlantis endures because it addresses the problem evidence cannot fully resolve: how to live with the knowledge that collapse is possible. The final significance of Atlantis lies in its silence. Unlike apocalyptic prophecies, it does not declare an end. Unlike utopian visions, it does not promise salvation. It simply shows consequence. This restraint gives the myth unusual authority. It does not instruct civilizations on what to do. It leaves them to decide whether they recognize themselves in the story. In this way, Atlantis respects human agency even as it warns of its limits. Across history, civilizations have struggled with continuity. Knowledge accumulates, yet wisdom often fractures. Institutions grow complex, yet their purpose becomes obscured. Atlantis represents the moment when complexity exceeds comprehension, when success masks vulnerability. This moment is difficult to identify from within. The myth externalizes it, offering a distant example that feels safe to examine. Yet the discomfort it provokes suggests that the distance is an illusion. By the end of its historical evolution, Atlantis has become less a story about destruction and more a story about forgetting. Plato emphasized that repeated catastrophes erased records, leaving survivors unaware of their own past. This theme resonates powerfully in a modern world saturated with information yet struggling with meaning. Data persists, but understanding remains fragile. Atlantis warns that preservation without interpretation is insufficient. Memory must be actively maintained, or it dissolves. This warning carries particular weight in a global civilization approaching planetary limits. Climate systems, technological infrastructures, and political institutions now operate at scales where failure affects billions. The stakes exceed those of any previous society. Atlantis offers no solutions, but it clarifies what is at risk. It frames collapse not as punishment or fate, but as outcome. This framing shifts responsibility squarely onto human choice. In its final form, Atlantis also challenges the idea of progress as inevitability. It reminds civilization that advancement does not erase vulnerability. Each gain introduces new dependencies. Each layer of complexity increases the cost of failure. Atlantis condenses this reality into a single unforgettable image. It shows that sophistication can coexist with fragility, and that awareness of this tension is essential for survival. The myth's endurance also reveals something hopeful. Atlantis continues to be told because humanity continues to care about its future. A civilization indifferent to its fate would have no use for cautionary tales. That Atlantis remains relevant suggests an ongoing desire to learn, to reflect, and to avoid repetition. The myth survives not because collapse is certain, but because prevention still matters. In this sense, Atlantis functions as a moral horizon. It marks the boundary beyond which civilization fears to go. It asks whether power will be matched by restraint, whether innovation will be guided by wisdom, and whether memory will outlast ambition. These questions have no final answers. They must be asked repeatedly by each generation in new forms. At the conclusion of its history, Atlantis no longer belongs to any single culture or discipline. It is neither Greek nor modern, neither myth nor history alone. It exists at the intersection of philosophy, psychology, ecology, and ethics. It is a shared inheritance shaped by those who engage with it. Its meaning is not fixed, but its function remains consistent, to hold a mirror to civilization at moments of confidence and doubt. Atlantis also illustrates the limits of human understanding. Despite centuries of inquiry, it resists resolution. This resistance is not a failure, but a feature. It ensures that the myth remains open, capable of absorbing new insights without being exhausted. Atlantis teaches that some stories are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be revisited. As the narrative closes, Atlantis stands as one of humanity's most enduring intellectual constructions. Not because it was ever found, but because it was never forgotten. It survived skepticism, misuse, and reinvention. It adapted without surrendering its core. Few stories achieve such longevity. Fewer still remain relevant across radically different modes of thought. In the end, the history of Atlantis is inseparable from the history of civilization itself. Each era reshaped the myth according to its fears and hopes. Each interpretation left a trace, layering meaning upon meaning. Atlantis became a palimpsest of human concern, its waters reflecting changing skies. The final question Atlantis leaves behind is simple and profound. If a civilization knows the story of its own potential downfall, what responsibility does that knowledge create? Awareness alone does not guarantee action, yet ignorance offers no defense. Atlantis exists in the space between these realities, reminding humanity that understanding carries weight. Thus, the story concludes where it began, not with certainty, but with reflection. Atlantis remains submerged, not beneath any sea, but beneath the surface of human thought. It waits not to be discovered, but to be recognized. Its history is complete, yet its relevance is ongoing. Atlantis endures because civilization endures, and because as long as humans build, they will wonder how long their creations will last. In that wondering, the ancient island continues to rise briefly in the mind before sinking again into memory.